Hello everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome to my channel. Those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also an author working on my first novel. And on my channel, we dig into the psychology behind the writing, behind the world building, behind the characters, behind the plot, because that is the best way to create a more well-rounded story. So for today, we are doing the first video in a series I mentioned, I believe it was a week ago. The videos kind of run together after a while. And that is, we are going to be taking a specific type of magic each week and we are going to be delving into it. And I am lucky enough to have some collaborators on some of these, including this one. So I will be adding Kelly's video to the description below as soon as she posts it. So make sure you check out the video for that. So for today, we're talking about elemental magic. So first off, what is elemental magic? Elemental magic at its core is essentially the ability to manipulate the elements: earth, water, air, fire. And in some cases, there are additional elements like metal or wood, but sometimes those are included in the other elements of earth and things like that. So for sake of simplicity, we're talking about the four main elements. And what I find most interesting with this type of magic is, I think of all the types of magic that we have, this one is probably most rooted in our own actual history. Historically, we have always kind of had a fascination with the elements. As far back as, I believe it's 500 BC, there were essentially beliefs that everything in the universe was made of these four main elements, and that different circumstances would cause them to shift and change. So used to be believed that, for example, blood was made up of, I believe it was fire and water was one thing they believed blood was made up of. And so the idea of being able to manipulate the elements isn't honestly too far-fetched if you look at this historical belief of everything is made of the elements. And it's not entirely wrong. I mean, as we know now, obviously, fire and water and air and earth are made up of much smaller elements, and then those are made up of atoms and things like that. But the basic idea that there was a base element that made up everything else is not entirely wrong. They just didn't quite break it down far enough. But this even went a little further into what we call humorism, which I'm sure some of you guys have heard of, which is basically was an idea that dictated and honestly was kind of the focus of medicine for a fairly long time. And it was this belief that the human body was made up of four humors. You had yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. And each of these actually corresponded to an element: earth, water, air, fire. And it was believed that too much or too little would throw everything out of balance. And so you had to replace or release some of these elements to obtain equilibrium and good health, essentially. You would meet some people that believed that the seasons also corresponded to an element and that each season also corresponded to an age. So, like I believe winter was the eldest, autumn was a mature man, and I believe summer was a young man and spring was a child. So we've been thinking about this for a while. So when you talk about elemental magic, the origin, you can kind of see where we got the origin from. But there's a little more to it than that as well, and that is the idea of alchemy, which is essentially this thought that you could turn one element into another. So the overall goal was to turn lead to gold. I mean, that was the ultimate goal. But again, it was all linked to the classical elements. Like gold was linked to fire, and I believe lead was linked to earth, and then you had the in between elements that they would shift from state to state to state. And as much as the end goal was gold for a lot of them, it wasn't just that. There was just this idea that you could shift from one element to another and use that both for health, technology, all this stuff. And I think that's really where we kind of first see elemental magic kind of come into play in stories and things like that. Is essentially it kind of starts with this idea of turning one element into another, and as we go along it slowly becomes manipulating one element. I think probably the most famous example is probably Avatar: The Last Airbender. I think that one is really where they kind of take the philosophy of the elements and they really run with it, because one thing that they do include is that all the elements are linked to each other, which was a belief that you had elements and they were on different levels. So, depending on who you asked, one element would be considered the highest level, one would be considered the base level, and the idea that you could jump from one to the other and that one affected the others, and it was all kind of a circular kind of belief pattern. That's not a new idea. That's something that's been around for a while. So when we're talking about elemental magic in stories, I think one of the most important things to consider is how do they affect one another? Because kind of like the old beliefs of humorism and things like that, energy is energy essentially. So in order to do anything, you have to have some kind of energy to it. So if you're going to be manipulating an element or shifting from one element to another, as some stories do, there has to be an energy that's powering it. It doesn't just come from nowhere. So it's kind of this belief that you're taking one element and you're not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily say manipulating it, you're just taking the energy from that element and pushing it into another. So it's this shift of energy from one place to another place, more than creating energy out of nothing. And I think that is a fun thing to do because in a magic system, it gives you all these limits that you want in a magic system. So if you're using elemental magic and you want to have the person able to, let's say, control a tidal wave, because a lot of people like to use water, you already have kind of a limit of, okay, I only have so much energy that I can pour into this. So you're not making your person overpowered. And I think that is something that is very easy to do with magic in general. But I think people really like to do it with elemental magic because I think it kind of ties into this idea of as much technology and as much as we learn about the world, nature is something we still are pretty much at the mercy of. I mean, we have warnings for tornadoes and hurricanes and things like that. We've learned some of the warning signs for like earthquakes and things like that. But when they actually happen, there's really not a hell of a lot we can do about it, except kind of ride it out and try to take as many precautions as we can. But actually doing something to stop a tornado or stop a hurricane, we're not at that point. We may not ever be at that point. And I think that's why people really like elemental magic, because it gives us power over nature that we don't usually have. And we see all the time the kind of destruction and power that nature has. I mean, you need only look up any natural disaster in history to find it. Um, and that's alluring. It's it's intriguing to think about, well, what if we weren't at essentially nature's beck and call? What if we weren't at nature's mercy? What if we actually had a means to counteract? And I think that's something I see in stories a lot, is kind of giving certain people the ability to not just be at nature's whim and to be able to take that control back. And I think that is something that's very tempting about elemental magic. The other thing I really find fascinating with elemental magic is that they are kind of counterpoints for one another, in that, for example, water can scatter earth, earth can smother fire, fire can burn up air, things like that. So you almost automatically have a counterpoint to any magic that you're going to be using, which again, in a magic system is really vital to have. Is you don't ever want someone that can kind of do everything. And somehow Avatar makes it work. I'm still not entirely sure how they make it work, but they make it work. But I think as a general rule, knowing that if you have someone that can control water and you have someone that can control fire, they're dangerous to each other. And likewise, someone that can control air and someone that can control earth, they're dangerous to each other, because they can either feed and help each other or they can smother each other. And within a plot, that can add some much needed tension in my mind. If you have, in the back of your mind, if you have this idea of, okay, I have all this power at my fingertips, but there's somebody else that has an equal amount of power. And that can force your characters to kind of make smarter decisions, think things through, not just rush in and essentially just do brute force. Because that can be very tempting with elemental magic, because like I said, nature is very dangerous and nature is very powerful. So the temptation to just rush in and say, okay, I'm just going to wipe everybody out with a flood is very tempting. But if you have this counterpoint of, okay, I may have power over water, but some of my enemies have power over earth or over fire, so me running in brute force isn't necessarily going to work. And I like that. I like when the nature of the magic itself comes with its own limitations. Because like I said, if you have too much power, it can sour a story. And I think it can be easy to do that with elemental magic. So that's just my basic take on elemental magic. Like I said, I think the origin of it is very interesting, because we do have so much of a historical link to all these elements. And even to this day, we still kind of have a link to it. One of the things they bring up is that the states of matter still kind of correspond to these original elements. Solid being earth, liquid being water, gas being air, and plasma being fire. And I think that's interesting, because you really do see it woven throughout our history about these elements and how we learn and evolve from them, but they're still kind of at our core and at our base. And I think that's why in stories, I often consider elemental magic not the oldest magic, but it is still a very old magic. And it's for that reason. And typically in fantasy and sci-fi, actually, the older a magic is, the more powerful it is. So when you're talking about something that has been around literally since the beginning of time, you've got a pretty powerful force at your fingertips, and that can be fun to play with. Hey guys, well, thanks for chiming in on my video on elemental magic. As I said, I'm going to have my collaborator Kelly's video up later. I will link to her as soon as it goes up, and I hope you guys will check her video out. I'm anxious to see what she has to say about it. We will be digging into other types of magic weekly from now probably till the second week in February because there are quite a bit. I hope you guys will chime in for that. If you guys like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe and leave me comments below or follow me on social media. I always love discussing these topics with you guys. If you have suggestions, feel free to let me know. And I hope to see you guys in the next video.